The air in the apartment always felt thin, as if the oxygen were being rationed, and for Ji-won, that was exactly how her marriage felt, suffocating. She sat at the sleek, minimalist dining table, swirling a glass of lukewarm wine, her eyes fixed on her husband, Minho, who was meticulously arranging his modest dinner of rice and kimchi. He was a man of muted colors, wearing a frayed gray sweater that seemed to perfectly encapsulate his personality, dull, unremarkable, and perpetually worn out. He didn't look up as she sighed, a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the silence of their cramped living room. Ji-won was 32, vibrant, and filled with a restless ambition that felt like a trapped bird beating its wings against the walls of a cage she had built for herself, a cage she was certain Minho was the gatekeeper of. To her, he was the embodiment of stagnant water. He never challenged, never surged, and never climbed. He worked a low-level clerk job that he had held for years, never once mentioning a promotion or even a desire for one. When he spoke, it was usually to ask about the grocery list or to apologize for being late, his voice a soft, apologetic murmur that made her skin crawl with irritation. She remembered the early days when she thought his kindness was a sign of a deep, gentle soul, but now, that kindness looked like a lack of backbone, a pathetic resignation to a life of mediocrity. Her phone buzzed on the table, a message from her friend Soare popping up on the screen, a link to an article about a mutual acquaintance who had just been promoted to a senior executive position. Ji-won felt a pang of resentment so bitter it made her teeth ache. She looked at Minho again. He was now wiping the table with a damp rag, his movements slow, his shoulders slumped in a way that made him look older than his years. He was like a ghost haunting his own life, and by extension, hers. "Do you ever think about the future, Minho?" she asked, her voice dripping with a practiced disdain that she no longer bothered to hide. He paused, the rag in his hand still, and offered a faint, tired smile that reached nowhere near his eyes. "I think about it every day, Ji-won," he replied softly. "I want you to be happy." She let out a dry, incredulous laugh, shaking her head as she stood up to leave the table. "You wouldn't know how to make me happy even if you had a roadmap. You're content with nothing, and that's your biggest flaw. You don't want anything for yourself, and because of that, you're just dead weight." She walked past him, her shoulder brushing his with a force that was deliberately cold. Minho didn't react, didn't argue, and didn't defend himself. He just stood there in the dim kitchen light, a silhouette of profound weariness. The next morning was a blur of high-speed activity for Ji-won, who spent her hours at the office networking with men who wore tailored suits and spoke of investment portfolios and vacation homes in Jeju. When she caught glimpses of herself in the office mirrors, she felt a profound sense of injustice, believing that she was destined for a world of elegance and success, currently tethered to a man who didn't even know how to order a decent glass of wine. Lunch with her colleagues was a ritual of humiliation for her marriage. They would talk about their husbands' lavish gifts or their bold professional moves, and when they asked about Minho, Ji-won would offer a vague, pitying shrug. "He's a good man," she would lie, the words tasting like ash, just a bit simple. Back home that evening, the cycle repeated. The apartment was dark, and Minho was already asleep on the sofa, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. He looked pale, almost translucent, in the glow of the television set he had left on at low volume. She didn't wake him. She didn't tuck a blanket around him. She simply stepped over his legs with a grimace of annoyance and retreated to the bedroom, locking the door behind her. She didn't notice the stack of bills hidden neatly under a magazine on the coffee table, nor did she see the way his hand was curled around a small, crumpled notebook as if it were a life raft. She crawled into bed and pulled the covers up, praying for a life that felt big, vibrant, and far away from the quiet, suffocating presence of the man who was, in her eyes, the only thing holding her back. She closed her eyes, imagining a future where she was finally free, oblivious to the fact that the only thing keeping the roof over her head and the life she felt she deserved intact was the very man she dismissed as a failure. He was there, hovering in the periphery of her life like a shadow, taking on the weight of a world she didn't even realize was pressing down on her, while she dreamed of escape, unaware that her anchor was beginning to fray. The silence in the apartment wasn't a peaceful one. It was a heavy, stagnant pool of unspoken truths and ignored sacrifices, and as the clock ticked toward midnight, the distance between them grew wider than the physical space of the room, a chasm of her own making that she was entirely too arrogant to notice. She drifted off to sleep, feeling superior in her dissatisfaction, while Minho continued to breathe for two, his heart laboring under the strain of secrets that were meant to be his final, quiet gift to the woman who despised his very existence. The divide between Ji-won and Minho had grown into an unbridgeable canyon, a silent, festering wound that defined every interaction within the four walls of their apartment. Ji-won no longer saw a partner, she saw a mirror reflecting everything she feared she was becoming: stagnant, invisible, and utterly unremarkable. Every morning was a calculated exercise in avoidance. She would rise early, dressing in sharp, professional attire that signaled a life she desperately wanted to inhabit, while Minho would be in the kitchen, his presence marked only by the soft clinking of ceramic. He would offer a quiet, "Good morning, Ji-won," but she would barely acknowledge him, her mind already occupied by the image of Jun Seo, a man from her firm who carried himself with the effortless arrogance of the successful. Jun Seo was everything Minho was not. He was bold, he spoke of global markets, he drove a car that gleamed like a status symbol, and he looked at Ji-won with a predatory, flattering attention that made her feel seen in a way Minho never could. The comparison became an obsession. She started bringing Jun Seo's name into their conversations, measuring Minho against him like a ruler against a stub. "Jun Seo closed another major deal today," she remarked one evening, watching Minho struggle to fix a leaking faucet. "He's already planning a partnership. Do you ever wonder what it's like to be respected, Minho? To be a man people actually look up to?" Minho stopped, the wrench slipping from his hands with a hollow thud. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look hurt in the way a man might be after an insult. He just looked tired. "I'm happy for your friend, Ji-won," he said, his voice as steady as a flat line. "Everyone has their own path. I just want to make sure your path is steady." His attempt at reassurance landed like a slap in the face. To Ji-won, his lack of ego wasn't a virtue, it was a surrender. He tried to be present, to bridge the gap with small, clumsy gestures, buying the expensive tea she liked, trying to engage her in conversation about her day, or waiting up for her late at night with a light meal, but every action felt like a desperate, pathetic plea for recognition she was no longer willing to give. When he tried to hold her hand during a rare moment on the sofa, she pulled away as if he were burning her. The resentment had calcified into something cold and jagged. Her family was no better. During a weekend dinner with her parents, the air was thick with their thinly veiled condescension. Her father, a man who measured success in bank accounts and accolades, wouldn't even look Minho in the eye. When the conversation turned to the potential expansion of their family's small business, her mother's eyes flicked toward Minho with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "Some men are built to be captains," her father remarked, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "and some are meant to be the ballast. We just hope you haven't weighted us down, Minho." Minho simply nodded, keeping his gaze fixed on his plate, while Ji-won felt the heat of shame creep up her neck. She didn't defend him. She didn't say a word to stop the humiliation. Instead, she leaned into it, nodding in agreement with her father's dismissal, feeling that by distancing herself from her husband, she might finally regain the status she felt she was losing. Her avoidance of home became a mission. She began staying late at the office under the guise of projects that didn't exist, finding solace in the bright, superficial lights of the city rather than the dim reality of her home. She drank cocktails with colleagues who gossiped about her husband's quiet nature, laughing along when they called him the invisible man. Every time she had to go home, she felt a tightening in her chest, a phantom sensation of being buried alive. One rainy Tuesday, she returned late to find Minho trying to fix a small bookshelf in their living room. He had moved furniture, his back soaked in sweat, struggling to stabilize a piece she had deemed too ugly to keep. "Why are you doing that?" she snapped, slamming her bag onto the floor. "It's garbage, Minho. It's always been garbage. Just like this apartment. Just like everything you touch." He turned to her, his face pale, a small tremor in his hands. "I thought it would make things more organized," he whispered. "I know you've been stressed, and I wanted to make the space feel a little more." "More what?" she interrupted, her voice rising in a sharp, hysterical crescendo. "More like the life of a failure? I look at you, and I don't see a husband. I see a shadow that follows me around, reminding me that I've settled for less than nothing. Do you have any idea how it feels? Every time I walk through that door, I feel like I'm suffocating. It's impossible to breathe here, Minho. You suck all the air out of the room with your mediocrity." She saw a flicker in his eyes, a momentary crack in the armor of his stoic indifference, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag, his movements slow and pained. "I see," he said, his voice barely a breath. "I didn't realize it was that bad." He walked past her toward the kitchen, not looking back, his posture hunched as if he were carrying an invisible weight that was slowly grinding his bones to dust. Ji-won stood in the center of the living room, her chest heaving, waiting for him to explode, waiting for him to shout, to throw something, to be a man. But there was only silence. He went to the kitchen and began preparing tea, the sound of the kettle hissing a quiet, rhythmic counterpoint to the thrumming in her veins. She went to the bedroom and slammed the door, burying her face in the pillow, wanting to scream, wanting to disappear, wanting to be anywhere else but trapped in a cage with a man who was so relentlessly, maddeningly quiet. She didn't notice that he didn't come to bed. She didn't notice the sounds of him working through the night in the study, the scratching of a pen, the rustling of papers, the long, labored sighs of someone who was running out of time. She only knew that the distance between them had reached its breaking point, and in her arrogance, she believed that he was the one who was failing the marriage, never realizing that he was the only thing holding up the walls she was so eager to tear down. She drifted into a light, uneasy sleep, convinced that she was the victim, that she was the one suffering, entirely blind to the fact that the person she despised was bleeding out in the room next door, sacrificing the last fragments of his energy just to ensure that tomorrow, she would wake up in a life that was still, for at least a little longer, entirely secure. She woke up the next morning feeling lighter, invigorated by her own anger, ready to leave the house and return to the world where she felt she belonged, never once looking back at the man who had stayed up all night, waiting to make sure the world she claimed to hate would not collapse around her shoulders. She left the house without saying goodbye, a final, cold note in a symphony of neglect that she had been composing for years, never knowing that it was the last time she would ever see him standing, the last time she would ever have the chance to say anything other than a cruelty. The air she found so hard to breathe in the apartment was, in truth, the only oxygen she had, and as she stepped out into the morning, she felt only the exhilaration of her own selfish freedom, oblivious to the fact that the silence behind her was about to become permanent. The silence that followed their last encounter did not break, it merely solidified, becoming the permanent atmosphere of their household. Ji-won spent the following week in a state of icy detachment, leaving early for work and returning long after Minho had retreated to his makeshift workspace or the quiet corner of the study. She felt a toxic sort of liberation in their lack of communication, a perverse comfort in knowing that she didn't have to look at his tired eyes or hear his apologetic tone. On that fatal Thursday, the city was choked with a suffocating, humid fog. Ji-won was caught up in a flurry of high-stakes meetings, her mind entirely occupied by a potential promotion that would finally validate her choice to distance herself from her husband. She hadn't heard from Minho all day. He usually sent a text, nothing more than a simple "have a good day" or "don't forget your umbrella," but today, the screen of her phone remained dark. She didn't mind. In fact, she relished the absence of his persistent, annoying presence. She was preparing to leave the office when her phone finally buzzed. It wasn't Minho, it was a stranger, a voice on the other end that sounded clinical and distant, speaking of a hospital, a cardiac event, and a massive, irreversible failure of a heart that had apparently been struggling for a long time. The world didn't stop. There was no cinematic swell of music, no sudden onset of cinematic tears. There was only a cold, clinical sense of disbelief that manifested as profound annoyance. She had to leave her meeting. She had to deal with the paperwork. She had to explain to her colleagues why she was suddenly leaving, and she felt a surge of irritation at the inconvenience of it all. When she arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell of disinfectant seemed to press against her lungs, mocking the very freedom she had been craving. Minho was already gone. They told her he had collapsed on the street, likely from extreme physical exhaustion coupled with an underlying condition he had never bothered to mention. He hadn't suffered, they said, as if that were supposed to be a comfort. She stood in the quiet room, looking at his body, which was now still in a way that finally aligned with the version of him she had created in her mind. He was just a shape under a white sheet, a person who had spent years being the boring, useless husband, now finally silent forever. She felt no sudden rush of grief. Instead, a strange, selfish clarity settled over her. She thought about the lease on their apartment, the way she could now move into a place that better suited her social standing, and the fact that she wouldn't have to endure those humiliating, quiet dinners anymore. She felt a flicker of something like relief, a dark, shameful thought that whispered, "Now, finally, my life will start to move." She went home that night to an apartment that felt cavernous and empty. She didn't cry. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, thinking about how she would clear out his things, how she would donate the ugly sweaters and the books he was always reading, how she would erase the traces of his existence so she could finally decorate the space with her own taste. She felt like an actress who had been trapped in a low-budget play and had suddenly been given the chance to audition for a leading role. There was no nostalgia, only the cold, calculated optimism of someone who believed the weight had finally been lifted. She didn't think about his last words, or the fact that she had slammed the door on him just days prior. She didn't wonder what he had been doing in the city center when he collapsed, or why he wasn't at his office. She was too preoccupied with the future, a future that she now saw as a clear, unobstructed path toward the success she had always felt she deserved. As the hours crawled toward dawn, the realization of his absence felt more like a logistical change than an emotional one. She started drafting a list of things to do: cancel the joint accounts, notify his distant relatives, hire someone to paint over the walls he had been trying to fix. Every item on the list felt like a step toward a better version of herself, a version that wasn't defined by the weak man who had died on a rainy street. She lay in the dark, her eyes wide open, feeling a chilling sense of empowerment. She was no longer a wife to a failure. She was a widow, and in the strange social circles she frequented, there was a kind of tragic dignity in that status that she could use to her advantage. She felt no guilt because, in her mind, guilt was for those who had something to regret, and she believed she had done nothing wrong. She had just been a woman waiting for her life to begin, and now, the obstacle had been removed by fate itself. She fell asleep thinking about the luxury apartment she would rent, the professional networking events she would attend, and the way her friends would look at her with sympathetic eyes, never knowing how much she truly disliked the man she was mourning. She was entirely blind to the fact that her life hadn't just changed, it had been severed from the very foundation that had been keeping it upright, and the ground beneath her feet was far less stable than she could possibly imagine. She didn't know that the silence she was celebrating was not a clean slate, but a trap. She was entering a chapter of her life where the ghosts of his actions would soon begin to manifest, turning her newfound freedom into an investigation of everything she had foolishly and arrogantly dismissed. But for that first night, she remained in her bubble of cold, indifferent victory, utterly unaware that the man she had treated as a non-entity was about to become the most important, and most haunting, figure of her entire existence. The darkness in the room was absolute, a perfect reflection of her understanding of her late husband, and as she drifted into a dreamless, hollow sleep, she felt a fleeting moment of satisfaction that the burden was finally gone, completely ignorant of the fact that the debt of his love was now the only thing she had left to pay, and it was a price she was nowhere near ready to comprehend. The funeral was a blur of black fabric, forced sympathies, and the persistent, nagging feeling that she was playing a part in a play she had never auditioned for. Ji-won stood by the graveside, her face a mask of composed grief, accepting condolences from people who barely knew Minho and certainly didn't care. She caught her mother looking at her with a mix of pity and impatience, clearly already calculating how long a decent widow's mourning period should last before she could be introduced to eligible men again. Returning to the apartment felt like entering a tomb, but for the first time, it didn't feel like her tomb. She sat down at the table, a stack of mail waiting for her: bills, notices, the mundane debris of a life interrupted. She reached for the pile, prepared to handle the tedious process of liquidation, but her hand froze over the first envelope. It was a statement from their bank, stamped in bold red ink: account balance cleared, mortgage fully discharged. She stared at it, the paper crinkling in her grip. This was impossible. They had been paying interest on that mortgage for years, a persistent drain on her salary that she had blamed Minho for failing to out-earn. She checked the next envelope, a notice from a credit agency stating that the substantial loan her family had taken out for their business expansion, for which they had been personally liable, was marked as settled in full via anonymous third-party transfer. A cold chill traced a line down her spine. Her family's business had been on the brink of bankruptcy. She had spent months terrified of the financial ruin that would follow. Now, it was gone. She scrolled through her phone, checking online portals, finding one account after another resolved, closed, or updated to a status of paid in full. It was as if a ghost had reached into the machinery of her life and oiled the gears, making everything run smoothly while she had been busy screaming at the machine for not working fast enough. Confusion quickly curdled into a sharp, rising anxiety. She walked into the study, the room Minho had rarely left in his final months, the room she had dismissed as his shrine to laziness. It was clean, almost surgically so. She pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk, which had always been locked. It opened with a soft click, revealing a neat stack of folders, each labeled with dates and names she didn't recognize. She sat on the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs, and opened the first one. It contained receipts, hundreds of them, for payments made to banks, to her father's creditors, even to the utility company that had been threatening a shutoff that she never knew about because Minho had apparently caught the notices before they ever reached the mailbox. There were bank statements, but they weren't in his name. They were shell accounts, linked to high-yield investment platforms and brokerage firms, showing massive, consistent growth. He hadn't been a low-level clerk, he had been operating a complex portfolio of investments that would have made a professional hedge fund manager sweat. She flipped through the pages, her breath hitching. Every single transaction was tagged with a note in his precise, cramped handwriting: for Jiwon's dream of an independent firm, emergency buffer for her parents' medical bills, security for our future. He had been funneling the entirety of his earnings and every cent he generated through these secret channels to protect her, to support her, and to insulate her from the very failures she mocked him for. She looked at his calendar, which she had ignored for years. It was filled with appointments at cancer centers, hospitals, and wellness clinics, all dated during the times she thought he was wasting his day. He had been battling something, she didn't know what yet, but the costs associated with these appointments were staggering, all paid out of pocket, all while he lived on instant noodles and wore sweaters that were years old. She felt a sickening wave of vertigo. The man she had called a parasite was the one who had been feeding the very life she was living. She had been judging him for his poverty, never realizing he was intentionally living in poverty so that she could live in the illusion of wealth. She looked at the last file, a folder labeled Jiwon's Future. Inside was a meticulously drafted plan for her professional success, including contacts for major industry players, a down payment on a commercial office space in the city's heart, and a letter of recommendation written by someone he had apparently worked for in the shadows, a person of immense influence. She had walked through life feeling like a victim, complaining about the limitations of her marriage, while he had been constructing a pedestal for her, stone by stone, hiding his own exhaustion behind a mask of, as she had called it, dullness. The silence of the apartment, once so irritatingly heavy, now felt deafening, filled with the echoes of his invisible labor. She held a bank statement, her fingers trembling, realizing that the weak man she had bullied into silence was, in truth, the only reason she had ever had a chance at the life she so desperately craved. She looked at the wall, at the space where he used to sit and watch her with those tired, patient eyes, and for the first time, she felt a crack in her own perception of reality. She had been the one living a lie, not him. She had been the one who was small, not him. The useless man had been her secret architect, and now that he was gone, she was left standing in the center of a mansion he had built, only to realize she hadn't even bothered to learn his name. The realization wasn't just a face slap. It was an existential earthquake that shattered the foundation of her entire world, leaving her to wonder just how much of his life he had surrendered to ensure that she would never have to face the world alone. She sat there in the dark, the documents scattered around her like autumn leaves, and realized with a terrifying clarity that she hadn't just lost a husband, she had lost the only person who had ever truly looked after her, and she had spent her final years with him treating him like an inconvenience. The air in the room didn't feel thin anymore, it felt suffocating, weighted with the gravity of his love and the sheer scale of her betrayal. The further Ji-won delved into the folders, the more the reality of her past dissolved, replaced by a devastating portrait of a man she had never truly seen. She began to cross-reference dates, and the picture that emerged was not one of a low-level clerk, but of a man who had been living 3 lives simultaneously. There were timestamped logs from a high-end logistics firm where he worked night shifts as a data analyst, a job he held for years while she slept, believing he was just staying late at his boring office to avoid her. She found receipts for luxury watches, vintage cameras, and limited edition memorabilia, items he had possessed when they first met, which she had mocked him for selling. Now, she realized he hadn't sold them because he was broke, but to inject capital into her father's crumbling furniture business. She recalled the day her father had boasted about a miraculous anonymous investor who saved them from bankruptcy. She had sat at the table and commented on how lucky the family was, while Minho had sat silently, nursing a cup of tea, his hands calloused from physical labor. She looked at a series of bank transfers directed to her younger brother, Suho. For years, she had believed Suho was just lucky with his scholarships and internships. In reality, every single one had been secured through massive, private donations to the institutions, all funneled through Minho's accounts. The weak husband had been the silent financier of their entire family's stability. A memory washed over her, sharp and painful, 3 years ago, when she had shamed him for wearing the same worn-out shoes for an entire winter. She had called him pathetic, a man who couldn't even afford a new pair of boots. Now, she found a ledger entry from that exact month, a heavy withdrawal for a surprise dental surgery for her mother, marked as anonymous gift. He had chosen to let her believe he was destitute rather than let her know her mother was suffering from a condition they couldn't afford to treat. The past versus now montage played in her head with agonizing clarity. She remembered the time he had come home with a deep bruise on his arm, claiming he had bumped into a door. She had rolled her eyes and turned on the television, ignoring him. Now, she found medical records from a clinic that specialized in workplace injuries consistent with manual labor. He had been taking on backbreaking jobs on the weekends to cover the soaring medical insurance premiums she demanded for their lifestyle. When she had accused him of being emotionally empty, he had actually been holding back his own agony, his own fears, and his own exhaustion, simply because he didn't want to weigh her down with the truth of their precarious situation. She remembered the boring weekends where he insisted on staying in, often falling asleep in the chair. She had ridiculed him for being a couch potato. In reality, he was likely recovering from a 48-hour stretch of working 3 different jobs just to keep their credit rating high enough for her to get the luxury car lease she had insisted on. Every time she had told him he was useless or a drag on her progress, he had stood there, his gaze downward, his jaw tight, not from a lack of backbone, but from an act of extreme, superhuman restraint. He had been protecting her from the reality of her own family's fiscal recklessness. She found a document from a private investigator, dated 6 months ago. Minho had hired someone to keep tabs on her father's gambling habits, not to expose him, but to intervene before the old man could lose the family home. He had been quietly paying off her father's gambling debts for years, all while the man insulted him at dinner parties. Ji-won let out a sound that wasn't quite a cry, a dry, hacking sob that tore through her chest. The man she had treated as a non-entity was the only one who had treated her like a treasure, sacrificing his dignity, his health, and his own potential to clear a path for her. She saw his handwriting in the margins of a report about a career coach. She needs to believe it's her own doing. She needs to feel empowered. I will be the shadow, she will be the light. The realization that he had intentionally cultivated her disdain in order to force her to be ambitious, to push her away from his own quiet life toward the career she wanted, was the ultimate sacrifice. He had become the villain in her narrative so that she could be the hero of her own. She stood up and walked to the closet, opening it to find the clothes she had mocked. They were all there, perfectly maintained, clean, and modest. Tucked in the back was the small, battered notebook she had seen him holding the night he died. She opened it to the last entry. It wasn't a suicide note, it was a gratitude journal. Today, Ji-won finally got the lead on that project she wanted. She looked so radiant, so happy. It was worth everything. If I am tired tomorrow, it doesn't matter. She is stepping into the light. She clutched the notebook to her chest, the weight of his love pressing down on her like a physical force. The weak husband, the boring man, the useless companion, every label she had slapped onto him was a monument to her own blindness. She had been living in a house of cards he had built with his own blood, and she had spent every moment she was there complaining about the drafts. She looked at her reflection in the bedroom mirror and finally, for the first time in her life, she felt true, unadulterated shame. She had spent years trying to be somebody by standing on his shoulders, while he had spent those same years trying to ensure she would never feel the ground give way beneath her. The tragedy wasn't just that he was dead, the tragedy was that she had finally discovered the depth of his character at the exact moment she had lost the opportunity to ever apologize. The silence of the apartment was no longer the silence of stagnation, it was the heavy, suffocating silence of a debt that could never be repaid, and as she stood in the center of the room, she realized that everything she thought she had earned was, in fact, a gift from a man who had asked for nothing in return. She had been the one who was empty, and he had been the one who was full of a love so profound that it had consumed his very existence, leaving her with a life she now realized was built on the wreckage of his shattered health and his silent, enduring, and ultimately fatal devotion. The apartment was no longer just a space, it was a museum of her own cruelty, and every object she touched felt like an indictment of her character. Ji-won sat on the floor of the study, surrounded by the remnants of Minho's secret life, the folders and ledgers splayed out like a confession she hadn't been ready to hear. The truth hit her with the cold, relentless force of a winter gale. He had never once complained. Not when she had come home late and berated him for not having dinner ready, oblivious to the fact that he had likely just finished a double shift at a labor-intensive job. Not when she had insulted his intelligence in front of her high society friends, watching him offer that small, polite smile that she had interpreted as stupidity but which now, through the lens of her discovery, she recognized as profound, self-sacrificial grace. He had never asked for a thank you. He had never sought the validation she so desperately craved, nor had he ever pointed out the hypocrisy of her demands. He had simply wanted her to be lighter, to have the burden of existence removed from her shoulders so that she could flourish in the world she desired. The realization caused her to finally, irrevocably break. The dam of her pride, which she had spent years carefully constructing, crumbled into dust. She let out a guttural, jagged cry that sounded alien in the quiet, sterile room. It was the sound of a woman waking up from a lifelong sleep to find that she had burned down her own house. She began to cycle through memories, but they were no longer the versions she had edited to suit her narrative of the oppressed, ambitious wife. She saw the past for what it really was. She saw herself, ice-cold and biting, telling him that being with him was like being buried alive, while he had merely nodded and moved to make her tea, his hand trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the terminal exhaustion of a man who was literally giving his life to ensure her path was smooth. She remembered the nights she had forced him to attend social events where she knew he would be embarrassed and sidelined, just so she could showcase their perfect domesticity to her colleagues. She remembered the times she had looked him in the eye and told him he was a failure, a man of no consequence, a drain on her potential. She had been the one draining the life from him, and he had allowed it, silently accepting her venom as if it were a necessary price for her happiness. The guilt was not just a passing emotion, it was a physical weight, a leaden anchor pulling her into the abyss of her own past failures. She thought of his face, the way it had grown gaunt and pale in the months leading up to his death, and how she had accused him of letting himself go because he wasn't keeping up with the physical standards she demanded. She hadn't seen the gray tint to his skin, or the way he struggled to catch his breath after climbing the stairs. She had been too blinded by her own narcissism to see the man who was fading away right in front of her. She looked at his chair, the one he had sat in every evening, and felt a wave of agony so intense it made her physically ill. He had sat there, waiting for her, holding his secrets and his fatigue, never once reaching out to tell her that he was hurting, because he didn't want to make his pain her problem. He had been a giant of a man, carrying a world of responsibility on his shoulders, while she had been a petulant child, screaming because the world wasn't perfect enough for her. "I didn't know," she whispered to the empty air, her voice cracking, but the words felt hollow and meaningless. Knowing didn't change the fact that she had been the architect of his loneliness. She had been the one who had made his life a gray, suffocating struggle, and the worst part was that he had loved her through it all. She remembered a small, trivial moment, a morning when he had tried to give her his last bit of savings to buy a new dress for an interview, and she had rejected it with a sneer, telling him to keep his pity money. She could still see the look in his eyes, not hurt, but a profound, steady patience as he had simply tucked the money back into his pocket and wished her luck. The memory made her double over, her body shaking with the intensity of her sobs. She had spent their marriage trying to prove that she was the talented one, the valuable one, the one destined for greatness, but she had been nothing compared to his quiet, monumental strength. She had been the shadow, and he had been the light, and he had willingly extinguished himself so that she could shine. The realization that she had spent their final years together treating him as a burden made her want to claw at her own skin. She had been so afraid of being ordinary that she had spent her life trying to distance herself from the only extraordinary thing she would ever have. The realization was a face slap to her ego, a violent correction that left her ego shattered on the floor. She had viewed their marriage as a prison, and he had been her jailer, but now she saw that he had been the guard, the provider, and the protector, all while she had been the prisoner of her own shallow expectations. There was no going back. There was no way to fix the years of neglect, the nights of biting silence, or the moments where she had looked at him with nothing but contempt. The weight of his love, revealed only now that he was gone, was a debt she could never repay. She was left in the wreckage of a life she had mistakenly thought was hers, realizing that it had been his all along, and that he had died leaving her the inheritance of her own, now utterly meaningless, success. She sat in the darkness, the only sound the ragged, desperate breathing of a woman who had finally, cruelly, and belatedly understood the value of what she had thrown away. The funeral was long over, yet the house felt as though it were being visited by a parade of ghosts, each bringing a fragment of the man Ji-won had failed to know. The doorbell rang incessantly. Her father arrived first, his usual air of arrogant superiority replaced by a shaky, bewildered demeanor. He sat in the living room, his hands trembling as he stared at the financial documents Ji-won had left scattered on the floor. "I didn't know, Ji-won," he whispered, his voice catching. "Every time I went to him to ask for a loan, to beg him to invest in my failing projects, he never once hesitated. He never made me feel small.
He simply handed me the checks, saying, "This is for the family, for Ji-won's peace of mind."
Her brother, Suho, followed, looking devastated. He explained how Minho had been the one to pay for his elite tuition and his initial startup capital for his own company.
"He told me not to tell you," Suho said, eyes brimming with tears.
"He said you were stressed enough with your own career and that you shouldn't have to worry about the family's stability. He worked those night shifts at the shipping warehouse and the logistics firm just so we wouldn't have to ask you for a cent.
I thought he was just a lucky, idle man. I was such a fool."
One by one, the people Ji-won had considered successful and above her husband came forward, peeling back the layers of his quiet life. A former supervisor from one of his secret jobs visited, telling Ji-won that Minho had been the most reliable, hard-working man he had ever employed, even when he was clearly suffering from persistent fatigue.
Then came the doctor.
The appointment had been scheduled by Minho weeks before his death, and the physician had come to pay his respects, unaware that Ji-won was entirely in the dark. As the doctor looked at the medical files, he stopped, his expression turning to one of profound sadness.
"He was a very brave man," the doctor began, his tone heavy.
"His heart condition was diagnosed months ago. He was prescribed a rigorous treatment plan and surgery that would have significantly extended his life, but he declined it." Ji-won stood frozen, the blood draining from her face.
"He declined it?" she asked, her voice a mere ghost of a sound. The doctor nodded, adjusting his glasses.
"He told me he couldn't afford the recovery time. He said he had an investment maturing that would secure his wife's future, and if he took the surgery, the window for that transfer would pass.
He knew the risks.
He knew that by choosing to continue his work to provide that financial foundation for you, he was effectively shortening his life. He chose your future over his own survival."
The emotional face slap was absolute.
Ji-won felt as though the floor had vanished beneath her. All those months she had criticized him for his laziness, his lack of ambition, and his dullness. He had been dying on his feet, literally trading his heartbeat for her comfort, her security, and her career trajectory. She remembered the nights he would fall asleep at the desk, the times he would skip dinner to go out for an errand, and the way he would look at her with such intense, quiet longing. It hadn't been the look of a man who was aimless, it was the look of a man who was saying goodbye without ever uttering the word. Her mother, who had spent years mocking Minho's simple appearance and lack of professional prestige, now sat in the kitchen, weeping into her hands. "He came to me," her mother confessed, "when I was diagnosed with that scare, and he paid the entire bill for the treatment before I even knew the diagnosis.
He made me promise to tell you it was covered by insurance.
He spent his entire life making sure we never felt the weight of our own mistakes, while we made him feel the weight of our judgments every single day." Ji-won walked through the living room, looking at the objects she had once deemed unworthy of her space, the books he read, the simple furniture he repaired, the clothes he wore. They were no longer objects, they were the remaining artifacts of a martyr. Every time she had been cold to him, every time she had laughed at his pathetic attempts to contribute, he had been nurturing her dreams with the remains of his own. The house was now filled with the weight of people who had finally realized they were standing in the presence of someone far greater than themselves, but it was too late. The man who had been the architect of their collective success was gone, and in his place was a gaping, hollow void. Ji-won went to the balcony, the cold night air biting at her skin, but she couldn't feel it. Her internal landscape was frozen, shattered by the realization that she had been loved with a purity she hadn't deserved. She had been the beneficiary of a sacrifice so immense that it eclipsed her entire existence. She looked up at the stars, feeling the crushing gravity of the truth. He hadn't been a weak man. He had been the only truly strong person she had ever known, and she had spent her life trying to outrun him, never realizing that he was the only thing tethering her to the earth. She realized then that the success she had been chasing was built on his burial ground. She had been so busy looking for a man who could provide her with the world that she hadn't realized her husband had already given it to her, piece by piece, until he had nothing left to give but his own life. The silence that followed the departure of her family was even louder now, a deafening echo of his presence, and as she stood in the dark, she knew that for the rest of her days, she would be haunted by the ghost of a man who had loved her more than he loved his own heartbeat. She hadn't just lost a husband, she had lost the only person who had ever truly seen her, the only person who had ever believed in her potential enough to sacrifice everything for it, and the sheer, agonizing reality of that loss was a burden she now had to carry alone, for the rest of her life, in the shadow of his silent, eternal grace. The transformation within Ji-won was not a sudden epiphany but a slow, agonizing renovation of her soul, conducted amidst the ruins of her previous life. She began by dismantling the facade she had meticulously curated for years. She resigned from the firm where she had spent her time posturing for status and instead turned her attention to the small, unfinished projects Minho had left behind. Her days were no longer defined by ambitious networking or the pursuit of social validation. Instead, they were consumed by the quiet, methodical labor of fulfilling his vision. She took the funds he had so carefully saved and, rather than using them to upgrade her lifestyle, she established a foundation aimed at supporting families in the same precarious financial situation hers had been in. She spent her mornings visiting the offices where he had worked night shifts, speaking to the men and women he had called colleagues, not as a superior, but as a student of his character. She learned how he had picked up extra shifts to cover for co-workers who were struggling, how he had mentored young clerks, and how he had never once spoken a harsh word, even when the work was grueling. It was a humbling education in human decency, a quality she had spent her life mistaking for weakness. Every day, she found herself mimicking his gestures, the way he would pause before speaking, the way he would listen with his whole heart, the way he treated the janitor with the same respect as the CEO. She realized that she had been living with a saint and treated him like a servant. She began to mend the relationships she had previously allowed to wither. She spent long afternoons with her parents, not as the haughty daughter she once was, but as a person who understood the value of presence and forgiveness. She helped her brother manage the business that Minho had quietly saved, ensuring that his legacy, the foundation of their family's stability, remained intact. Yet, despite these efforts to honor him, she was haunted by a relentless, corrosive thought: she was only doing these things because he was no longer there to do them for her. The realization that she had only begun to respect him once he was safely buried beneath the earth was a sickness in her heart that no amount of good deeds could cure. Every time she felt a sense of peace or accomplishment, it was instantly poisoned by the knowledge that this feeling had been bought with his life. She was essentially a ghost of his intentions, living out the remainder of her days in the shadow of his sacrifice. She would often find herself sitting at their old table, the one he had wiped down every night, waiting for his return, even though she knew with a sickening finality that he would never walk through that door. She started to hold herself to the same standard of silent, selfless love that he had practiced. When she saw someone in need, she acted immediately, often anonymously, just as he had. She found that the world looked different through his eyes. It was less about conquest and more about connection, less about being seen and more about ensuring that others were supported. But the ache of his absence was a constant, dull throb that worsened whenever she achieved something meaningful. She would look at the success she had finally secured, the stability, the independence, the growth of her family's business, and she would think of him. She would think of how he would have beamed, not with pride in her success, but with the quiet, profound satisfaction of a man who had done his job. She was living in the reality he had created for her, a reality she had once deemed beneath her, only to discover that it was the only reality that had ever mattered. The cruelty of her hindsight was a weight she carried everywhere. She became a woman of few words, choosing her speech with the same deliberate, gentle caution he had used. Her friends, the ones who had once mocked Minho, were now unsettled by her presence. They couldn't understand why the sharp-tongued, ambitious Ji-won had become so soft, so observant, and so unexpectedly kind. She didn't bother to explain. How could she? How could she tell them that she had been a hollow person until the man she despised had shown her what it meant to be whole by disappearing? She spent her evenings in the study, reviewing his notes, learning about the charities he had supported and the causes he had championed, and she realized that his life had been a massive, intricate tapestry of kindness that she had been too arrogant to look at. She was now the weaver of that tapestry, but her hands were clumsy and she felt like an imposter. The guilt remained, a constant, sharp prick in the back of her mind, a reminder that she had wasted the most precious gift she would ever receive, the presence of a man who loved her unconditionally. She had traded his warmth for her vanity, and now, all she had left was the cold, clinical task of continuing his work in his name. Every time she succeeded, she whispered his name to the empty room, not as a prayer, but as a confession of her own worthlessness compared to him. She was, in essence, trying to pay back a debt that could never be settled, a life for a life, an ambition for a legacy. And in that, she found a strange, painful purpose. She realized that she would never be able to fully rectify her past, but she could spend the rest of her existence ensuring that the world was slightly better, just as he had, even if she had to live every moment in the crushing awareness that she had discovered his value a lifetime too late. She was no longer the woman who wanted to climb to the top of the world, she was the woman who finally understood that the most important parts of the world were the quietest ones, the ones she had spent her life trying to escape, only to find that they were exactly where her heart belonged, waiting in the silence she had left behind. The final piece of his life emerged not from a folder or a ledger, but from the most unlikely of places, the lining of a small, worn-out jewelry box she had once dismissed as a cheap trinket. Inside, tucked away beneath a velvet cushion, was a single, folded piece of paper, a letter, dated just a few days before his collapse. Ji-won's hands shook so violently that she could barely unfold the parchment, the paper thin and fragile, much like the life he had been struggling to maintain for her. She sat on the floor, the golden light of the setting sun casting long, mournful shadows across the room, and began to read. His handwriting was neat, precise, and devoid of any tremor, a stark contrast to the state he must have been in when he wrote it. To my dearest Ji-won, the letter began, and the simplicity of the salutation caused a sob to catch in her throat. She braced herself for an indictment, for the accusation she knew she deserved, for the words that would finally solidify her status as the villain of his story. But as her eyes scanned the lines, there was no anger, no bitterness, and certainly no blame. He wrote about the day they met, about how he had been captivated by the fire in her eyes, by her ambition, and by the way she refused to accept the world as it was. He confessed that he knew exactly how she felt about him, that he was aware of the silence, the distance, and the growing contempt she held for his quiet nature. I never saw it as a burden, he wrote, I saw it as the price of your growth. I knew that for you to become the woman you were meant to be, you needed someone to hold the ground beneath you, even if you never noticed the hands that were doing the holding. If my silence allowed you to find your voice, then it was a silence worth keeping. Ji-won pressed the letter to her chest, her heart shattering into pieces she knew she would never fully gather again. He spoke of the nights he worked at the warehouse and the late hours spent managing investments, not as a struggle, but as a privilege. To build a future for you was the greatest honor of my life, he wrote, and though I was tired, I was never unhappy. I was simply a man who was lucky enough to be the shadow for your light. She read on, the tears blurring the ink, bracing herself for the final emotional blow. It came in the form of his final request, a request that felt like a physical strike to her soul. I know that by the time you read this, you will have discovered the truth, and I suspect that the weight of it will be heavy. Please, my love, do not let this truth become your prison. Do not spend your days trapped in the dark room of regret or the cold chains of guilt. My sacrifice was mine to make, it was a choice born of love, and a choice I made willingly. It was never intended to be a cage for your spirit. If you truly wish to honor what I did, then you must promise me one thing, you must find a way to be happy. Not for me, but for the person you have become. I have seen the strength you possess, even when you did not see it yourself. If you spend your life grieving for me, then I have failed to give you the one thing I wanted most, a life where you are truly free, not just from me, but from the shadow of everything that held you back. Let go of the guilt. Let go of the past. Go out into the world and live, not as my widow, but as the woman you were always meant to be. Be happy, Ji-won. That is the only thanks I ever wanted, and the only legacy I wish to leave behind. The letter fell from her hands, landing softly on the carpet, but she didn't reach for it. She sat there, paralyzed by the sheer, devastating magnitude of his grace. He had given her everything, his health, his time, his resources, his future, and then, in his final act, he had surrendered his right to her mourning. He had stripped her of the only thing she felt she had left, her self-flagellation. He didn't want her sorrow, he wanted her joy. It was the most selfless, and therefore the most painful, act of love she had ever known. She had spent years despising him for his lack of greatness, only to find that he was the greatest soul she had ever encountered. The emotional face slap was not just in his sacrifice, but in his total, unconditional forgiveness. He had seen her for who she was, flawed, arrogant, and blind, and he had loved her anyway, enough to ensure that her mistakes didn't define her future. She looked around the room, at the life he had built for her, and for the first time, she didn't see the wreckage of her own failures, but the foundation of a potential she had yet to realize. He had set her free, not just from the financial burdens of their past, but from the mental prison she had built for herself. The irony was so sharp it almost killed her. He had lived a life of total constraint so that she could live a life of absolute liberation. She remained on the floor as the room deepened into twilight, the letter resting like a silent witness to a love she had squandered but was now, through his final command, finally starting to understand. She was no longer just the widow of a man she hadn't loved, she was the bearer of a mission he had entrusted to her, a mission that began with the impossible task of forgiving herself. She realized then that his love hadn't just been a gift, it had been a rescue mission, and even though he was gone, the mission was ongoing. She would have to learn how to be the person he believed she was, and that was the ultimate burden he had placed upon her, a burden of hope, a burden of life, and a burden of happiness that was far heavier, and far more demanding, than any debt she had ever tried to repay in the days after his passing. She was free, but as she looked at the empty seat where he used to sit, she knew that this freedom would always be haunted by the ghost of the man who had loved her enough to set her on the path to a happiness he would never get to witness. The seasons shifted, and with them, the harsh, angular lines of Ji-won's life softened into something more nuanced and profound. Time, that relentless healer, had done its work, not by erasing the memory of Minho, but by integrating his presence into the very fabric of her daily existence. She was no longer the restless, arrogant woman who had once stood at the window, staring out at a city she believed she was meant to conquer. She had found a different kind of strength, one rooted in the realization that true power lay not in external status, but in the quiet, steady preservation of the people and values one held dear. Her family's business was now thriving, transformed by her infusion of his meticulous, ethical approach to management, yet she rarely spoke of her own success. Instead, she spent much of her time overseeing the foundation he had inspired, a sanctuary for those struggling in the shadows, people who, like Minho, carried burdens the world was too busy to notice. She had become a quiet guardian of the dignity of others, and in doing so, she found a sense of peace that had long eluded her. She still kept his study exactly as it had been, a space that felt less like a tomb now and more like a cathedral of memory. She didn't visit it to mourn, but to remind herself of the standard of love she was now striving to meet. The anger had long since dissolved, replaced by a deep, enduring gratitude that pulsed beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. She had fulfilled his final wish, she had learned how to be happy, not in a loud, performative way, but with a quiet, genuine contentment that allowed her to breathe freely. She had learned to appreciate the simple textures of life, the way the light hit the kitchen table in the morning, the sound of rain against the window, the feeling of a day well spent in the service of others. She had let go of the need to be the center of the world, discovering that the world was far more beautiful when one stopped demanding that it revolve around them. One clear, crisp autumn afternoon, she made the journey to the seaside cliff where they had shared their first, innocent date years ago. It was a place of wild grasses and salt-sprayed rocks, a place that had seemed so vast and promising when they were young and naive. She stood at the edge of the overlook, the wind pulling at her hair, looking out at the endless, churning horizon where the gray water met the pale sky. The pain of his absence was no longer a sharp, tearing sensation, it was a dull, constant ache, like the phantom limb of a body that had been amputated but never forgotten. She remembered the version of herself that had walked this path before, the girl who looked at Minho and saw a man who was lacking, a man who didn't fit into the grand design of her future. How small she had been. How utterly blind to the magnitude of the person standing right beside her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, worn ring he had given her, not an expensive diamond, but a simple, modest band that he had saved for months to purchase. She had kept it in a velvet box for years, viewing it as a symbol of her mediocrity, but now, she wore it on her finger, a constant, physical reminder of the man who had loved her with such unwavering, absolute commitment. She closed her eyes and let the sound of the waves fill the space where her own ego used to reside. She wasn't just remembering him, she was acknowledging him. She was letting him know that she had finally understood the gravity of what he had given, and that she was doing her best to honor that gift with every breath she took. She felt a strange, ethereal lightness, as if the last chains of her guilt had finally snapped, carried away by the salt-heavy wind. She understood now that he hadn't left her with a life of emptiness, he had left her with a blueprint for a life of purpose. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, bathing the world in a warm, amber glow, she stood tall against the breeze, her gaze steady and clear. She was no longer running from the life he had built for her, she was stepping into it, fully and completely, carrying his memory not as a weight, but as an anchor and a compass. The world around her felt vast, yet strangely intimate, a place where every small act of kindness was a ripple in the sea he had taught her to navigate. She whispered a quiet, final thank you to the empty air, the words carried away by the tide, and felt, for the first time in her life, a sense of absolute wholeness. She turned away from the cliff's edge and began the walk back toward the world, not as a woman searching for meaning, but as someone who had finally found it in the silence he had left behind. She stopped for a moment, looking back one last time at the path they had walked together, and the realization crystallized in the stillness of her heart, clear and immutable as the stars beginning to prick through the twilight sky. Only after I had lost him did I truly understand. All this time, my world had been held up by him. It was a truth that settled into her bones, a final piece of the puzzle that had eluded her through years of ambition and bitterness. She realized that the stability she had taken for granted, the roof over her head, the opportunities that came her way, the very health of her family, had not been the result of luck or her own perceived talents. It was a structure built entirely upon the bedrock of his secret, silent labor. She walked slowly back to her car, the crunch of gravel beneath her feet sounding like the steady heartbeat of a life he had nurtured. For a long time, she had walked through the world with her head held high, convinced that she was the one driving her destiny, while he had been the one clearing the thorns from the path ahead of her. She had been the dancer, but he had been the stage; she had been the song, but he had been the breath. As she started the engine and watched the coastline blur into the gathering dark, she didn't feel the crushing weight of the past anymore. Instead, she felt a profound sense of responsibility. She understood now that the only way to repay a debt that could never be settled was to live a life that mirrored his own, a life of quiet significance. She would continue to serve the foundation, she would continue to cherish her parents, and she would move through the world with the same gentle, unassuming grace he had possessed. She realized that by loving others with the same selfless intensity he had directed toward her, she was essentially keeping a piece of him alive, forever ensuring that his influence would ripple outward into a world that had once been too distracted to notice him. She reached over to the passenger seat and touched the small, leather-bound notebook she had kept there, his gratitude journal, its pages now soft and worn from her touch. It was her most prized possession, a testament to a man who had found his happiness in the mere act of giving. She felt no need for grand monuments or public displays of grief. His legacy wasn't written in stone or corporate buildings, it was written in the continuity of her own actions and the peace she had finally cultivated in her soul. She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror, and for the first time, she saw not just the woman she had fought to become, but the woman he had always seen, a person capable of love, sacrifice, and true connection. She pulled onto the main road, the city lights flickering ahead like embers in the night, and she felt a sudden, sharp, and beautiful clarity. The path ahead was no longer about climbing to the top, it was about walking with purpose, about being the light for someone else, just as he had been for her. She took a deep, steadying breath, the air filling her lungs with the scent of the sea and the promise of a future that finally felt entirely her own, yet inextricably linked to his grace. As she merged into the flow of traffic, moving forward into a life he had bought for her with the currency of his own heart, she whispered one final, lingering thought to the man who was no longer in the passenger seat, but who remained, in every meaningful way, the navigator of her soul. I am finally home, Minho. And this time, I will never stop building what you started. She drove on, the darkness no longer a source of fear, but a canvas upon which she would spend the rest of her life painting a legacy worthy of the man who had loved her into existence. The journey was long, and the lessons were hard-won, but she knew that at every turn, his quiet strength would remain her guiding star, leading her toward a happiness that was as deep, as enduring, and as profound as the love she had finally, agonizingly, come to understand. She was at peace, she was prepared, and for the first time, she was truly grateful for every lesson, every tear, and every silent, beautiful moment that had brought her to this place of absolute and final clarity.